This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Pet injury is an additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
Hi, I'm Caitlin, a podcast producer here at C-SPAN. This week on C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast, health reporter Shefali Luthra looks at the impact that the 2022 Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade has had on patients seeking an abortion. Kaiser Family Foundation Health News Chief Washington correspondent Julie Rovner interviews her.
Shefali, I am so excited to be with you here to discuss your book. Let us start at the beginning. Like me, you're a reporter covering the impending and then actual fall of Roe v. Wade. What made you want to add to your already overloaded work schedule and add a book to it?
It just felt so important to me that we have something really comprehensive that went beyond the day-to-day news and beyond the politics to really understand who are the people who are affected by this. What does it mean to live as someone who can become pregnant in an America without Roe v. Wade? I don't know of any other format other than a book in which we can really get into those stories. And it was obviously a lot of work to do while covering this, but it just felt so critical, and I'm so glad that we finally have the finished product.
So obviously 2024 abortion is an enormous subject, one that encompasses politics, religion, healthcare, gender equality, among other things, yet you very specifically focus on providers and patients. Why was it that you thought that was the most important place to focus?
There's an obvious answer, which is I'm a health reporter, and when I write stories, I think about doctors, nurses, medical personnel, and I think about the people they treat. But in this particular story as well, I think that this can feel so abstract for so many people. They understand abortion as a political issue. They understand it as something they might hear about at church, they might think about through all these other lenses. But to really understand what this means, you need to know what it feels like to be in a clinic or to be at home getting pills, to look at that pregnancy test and see, I am pregnant and I don't want to be, and to figure out what that means. I think that only by really spending time with these stories can we fully grasp what world we are living in now and how much it has changed from 2 years ago.
And really the focus on providers too. I think, we sometimes do think about the patients, but we rarely think about the people who are providing abortions. They are caricatured by the anti-abortion movement as people who are out to make profits. They are somewhat ignored by most of the medical community. I mean, you really found a number of healthcare professionals, abortion providers and providers of other care who were truly torn by all of this.
And what's so striking to me is these are very, very well-trained physicians, nurses, technicians. They have gone to school in some cases for a very, very long time to learn how to do the care that they are providing. And what they have seen is their expertise just completely dismissed. And there are political reasons for this, of course. We have abortion bans that are in effect that lawmakers did not intend to have an impact when they passed them. We have, as you mentioned, this long history of the anti-abortion movement vilifying doctors, in part because it was a politically easier sell than vilifying pregnant people. But what I really found was these healthcare providers have been working tirelessly, not even for just the past 2 years, but especially now. And they feel a great sense of moral urgency, of the duty that they took on when they underwent medical training to provide care for their patients. And they also are just so afraid of what comes next. They know that things can only get worse for them and for their patients unless there is political change.
A lot of the coverage of sort of post-Roe, and I am guilty of this as much as anybody, has been of these, what I call the wanted pregnancies that have gone wrong. They're mostly white, mostly upper middle class women who have the ability to speak out and get on TV and into newspapers, who have truly tragic stories. But that's not really the majority of abortions, or even it is a minuscule piece of the people who get abortions every year. Tell us sort of how it shakes out. Who are the people who most get abortions in this country?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because it was really important to me that this book capture that, which is people who get abortions, they are usually in their 20s, they are usually people of color, they are usually already moms, and they usually discover this pregnancy and do not want to keep it, cannot keep it because of economic reasons, because they know intimately what it means to already have a child and to know that they cannot go through that again while being a good parent to the family they already have. There's a story in this book that I think about a lot of a young woman named Angela who is exactly that. She is a young mother from Texas. She is Latina. She has only just had her son when she learns she is pregnant again. And that is the kind of story that maybe is harder to talk about because it doesn't tug at your heartstrings in the obvious way of the person who almost died wanting to have a kid. But it's so important, and these are stories that really deserve our attention because they reflect the reality of who is most affected.
So I feel like you've chosen people, individuals, to represent sort of the populations that are most likely to find themselves in need of an abortion and having a difficult time getting one. Talk about how you sort of decided to structure the book.
The book is structured in 4 parts, and there are 4 main characters we follow. Many other smaller stories come up along the way, but there is a young woman named Tiff, who is a teenager in Texas when she becomes pregnant. Before Roe is overturned, actually, but after Senate Bill 8, the 6-week abortion ban cut off access for most Texans. She ultimately does have a child, and her story really illustrates for us the systemic barriers that make abortion impossible, even when you already have this little window that exists. There is the story of Angela, who I just mentioned, and she captures exactly that, the normal person who is seeking an abortion, the parent, and what it means to be a working person, to struggle to find the $600-700 to pay for that, and that is just too much, and to find travel costs on top of that, and the stigma that comes around abortion. She can't tell her family about this because she knows that they would judge her and look down on her and maybe even cut her out of their lives. There is a mother named Darlene, whose story I spend a lot of time on. She is closest to the stories that we often hear about, where she becomes pregnant and really wants to keep the pregnancy, but there are complications where she is not sure if it is safe. No doctor is sure if it is safe, but they can't even give her sound medical advice because they are so afraid of breaking the state's laws. And ultimately, she has the means to fly to California from Texas to get medical care that is actually appropriate and comprehensive and allows her to make her decision for herself. And the last story I think about is a young man named Jasper, and he lives in Florida, and he is trans. And he finds out he is pregnant right before the then 15-week ban is in effect. His story is so important to me for a few reasons. There is the fact that not all people who get abortions are women, and we need to talk about that. We often don't. There are non-binary people and trans people. For someone like Jasper, he is living in a world that has put real restraints on his healthcare on 2 fronts: the abortion that he ultimately pursues and gender-affirming care that is important for his medical health and well-being. And on top of that, his story really underscores how even a 15-week ban on abortion can have really, really intense consequences. He doesn't find out he's pregnant in part because no one thinks to test him for pregnancy because he looks like a man. And when he does learn, he has 1 week, even in this 15-week cutoff, to decide he wants an abortion, to find the money, to make the appointments, and to go to a clinic twice over 24 hours. He thinks a lot in the following times whether that was the right decision. And even though he knows he can't be a parent, all he wishes is that he'd had more time to make that decision on his own terms.
I've been covering abortion for a long time, since the late 1980s, and I'm kind of jealous because all of the years I was covering abortion, Roe was in existence. Abortion was technically legal every place in this country, and yet it was so difficult to find either providers or patients who were willing to talk to me and have their names used because there was so much stigma around abortion. People, we would hear that 1 of every 3 or 1 of every 4 women had had an abortion, but most people don't know that they're friends and or relatives, because as you say, even now, people are afraid to tell their close friends and their family members that they're doing this. How did you find these people? And I confess I'm jealous that people are now willing to talk about this more openly. I think it's come as a big surprise to a lot of people how common abortion is, how common pregnancy complications are. I mean, it's not just people who are young and discover that they're pregnant. It's people who are getting pregnant on purpose and then having difficulties later on.
I think what you're speaking to is there really has been this shift in the culture of how we talk about pregnancy and how we talk about abortion. And part of that comes from every single story that is published. It makes it a little bit easier because people see there is someone else out there like me. And maybe if I share my story as well, the next person won't feel alone too. There's a real sense of moral urgency that I felt like I heard from patients and providers, especially in the post-Dobbs landscape. They really, really hoped that by being public about their experiences that they would lead to, at the very least, people understanding just what it means to be someone who can become pregnant in this country and just what a burden has been placed upon them because of these new laws.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because the name of the book is Undue Burden, which is kind of a double entendre for those of us who are deep into this issue. Tell us why you named it Undue Burden and what that refers to.
Undue burden, as you know and as you referenced, it's a phrase that comes from a Supreme Court case, the less famous Roe v. Wade case in some ways, Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which that decision came in 1992, and it was seen at the time, many expected it to overturn Roe. And in fact, it upheld Roe, but it weakened it. It said that states could not ban abortion, but they could regulate it as long as the laws they passed did not impose an undue burden upon people seeking care. And this was a very confusing standard. People did not really know what it meant, and it had been interpreted in lots of different ways. It was used to uphold a lot of restrictions, even before Dobbs, that made abortion, if not illegal, still quite difficult to come by. It was not easy to get an abortion, even under the Roe-Casey framework. When I thought about Undue Burden as a title, and I have to give some credit to my brilliant editor, Kara Riley at Doubleday, who it was one of her ideas, and I just fell in love with it because we are living in that world now. People are, in fact, faced with that undue burden, and this is what that looks like.
Talk about some of the barriers. I mean, even before, Roe v. Wade fell, because I think you illustrated so well in the book about the difficulties, even where abortion is legal, in getting abortions.
Abortion has been so hard to come by for a long time. And part of that is what it means to get health care in this country in general. Abortions are expensive. They are an inherently unplanned expense. And even before the Dobbs decision, most insurance plans, especially Medicaid, did not cover abortion, which means you have to pay for something you definitionally did not expect to, and it will at a minimum be hundreds of dollars, but it can be thousands. If you're later in pregnancy, it can be tens of thousands of dollars. And where we are now is the stakes are even higher. If you are traveling out of state for care, you need to find potentially childcare. You need time off from work. You need someone potentially to come with you if you are having a later abortion and it is more advanced. You might need to rent a car, find plane tickets, find a hotel, figure out how to get around in a place you've never been to before. These are incredible barriers even for people with great means, and what it speaks to is just abortion has never been easy to come by, but now even with a right that is protected in some states, it will become more difficult and has become more difficult for all of us.
As you point out in the book, a lot of what's happening is completely predictable. Was there something that really surprised you in the reporting of this?
I think what I have been struck by over and over again has been the power of medication abortion. And this is something we read about in the news as well, that there are doctors who have gotten these shield laws passed in their states that are meant to protect them as long as they stay in their home states, and they are prescribing and mailing pills to people in states with abortion bans. So if I lived in Texas and wanted to order abortion pills, I could have a doctor in New York prescribe them to me, and they would mail them. And in theory, at least the doctor would be protected. This would be medically very safe. I could terminate my pregnancy at home. This has become a much more common regimen. But even as I was so surprised and really taken by how much this has achieved, I think it's important to note that it's not an option that works for everyone. It's not an option that would have worked for a lot of the patients we describe in this very book. And it does come, even if patients are not breaking laws because abortion bans do not target the patients, it still brings legal risk that a lot of the people I spoke to are very concerned about.
Yeah, I did. I noticed that people you talked to seemed very worried, even though they, in theory, could not be prosecuted themselves. There just seems to be so much uncertainty in all of the states with bans and states with restrictions and states without restrictions.
And there's some really great polling that's been done by KFF that shows that people largely don't know what the abortion laws are in their home states. And then you add on this fear, this sense that, well, my state did say it's illegal, and here I am trying to get one. What if I am breaking the law? We don't know what our health care costs. Like, we don't know all sorts of things. It is a lot to ask someone to be able to keep track of these drastically changing laws and what the punishments are and who is covered by them and who is not.
And they change frequently.
They change constantly. I was in Florida a couple of weeks ago, and I remember hearing people calling the clinic on the phone to figure out what the abortion law was there because they had just switched to a 6-week ban. They did not know Florida had switched. When they tried to understand the different laws in North Carolina versus Virginia, they were really confused. They didn't understand why I had to wait and go 2 visits separately in North Carolina, but not in Virginia, but the appointment is closer in North Carolina, but in Virginia, I could still get my abortion faster. It's just such a patchwork system. It is so hard to understand, even if you cover this full time.
Yeah, I know. One of the things that surprised me is that a lot of the states that are putting themselves out as havens, places, blue states that have a lot of abortion clinics and, abortion rights supporting legislatures and governors actually haven't done all that much to help a lot of these abortion clinics, particularly those near the border where people are coming from the states where it's now illegal.
I had some fun writing those chapters. If we go back to, there's one chapter set in Illinois and New Mexico, these 2 bordering states that have seen a lot of people travel there for abortions, especially Illinois. But if we go back to the summer that Roe v. Wade was overturned, the Illinois governor said he would immediately call a special session and pass all these laws to make sure that Illinois could be a sanctuary. He didn't do that. He waited until the legislature came back, and then they passed laws, and then they added more support. And you work on your own schedule. But what that really underscored for me and many people I spoke to is that there were differing levels of urgency based on how immediately and how intimately you were affected. The other state that I think about a lot is California, which has seen also a lot of people traveled there from out of state. The state has put funding into trying to support abortion care in their state and for people traveling there. But it's a tremendous burden to be placed upon a system that was already underfunded because states have never put a lot of money into abortion and the federal government doesn't. And what we see is the system that has been underfunded for a long time gets some more resources, but still has a tremendous new strain upon it. And at the same time, you have people being asked to do something really quite incredible, fly from Texas or Louisiana or somewhere equally far to California for an abortion on a short timeline because of the time sensitivity of this procedure. It's too much for single states to try and fix on their own.
Of course, this is exactly what the anti-abortion community wanted, right? That they wanted to make abortion as difficult to obtain as possible in as many states as possible.
And that's exactly right. The goal was always to make abortions not happen, to have people stay pregnant and give birth and have more children. And I think there are some things that we get at in this conversation even that have frustrated the anti-abortion movement. The fact that people have been able to travel, have been able to have pills mailed to their homes, those are sources of deep frustration to them, and they would love to find ways to limit that. They are working actively to figure out how to get to that next stage where if abortion is illegal in your state, you are not going to get one. But I mean, it is certainly a success for them that even when people can circumvent these bans, it is incredibly difficult for them to do so.
I feel like Dobbs is kind of this rock that's been dropped into a pool, and we have these ever widening ripples. I mean, sort of the first one is, as I think you've already mentioned, are the stress on the abortion clinics sort of near the border in the border states to states with bans, but also it affects how women get other sorts of medical care and other sorts of reproductive health care, right?
Exactly. I spoke to a lot of doctors who, they used to provide colposcopies and they used to provide pap smears and contraceptive care, and then they only had time to do abortions. There's a clinic that I think about that used to do gender affirming care, and they couldn't because now they only can do abortions. And this really underscores the spillover consequences. You may live in a state where your healthcare laws have not changed, where if anything, your right to an abortion has been strengthened, but that doesn't mean that you aren't losing access to reproductive health care, because we are just putting a really intense burden upon a deeply frail system, and we don't have the means to to address that, to make this system less frail, to bring it back to the size it once was, let alone where it would need to be to adequately respond to what patients are looking for.
And yet, one of the things I think that was unintended but has happened is that because it's become so much more difficult to get an abortion in many of these states, people are having abortions later in pregnancy, which of course is the opposite. If you look at public opinion polling, people are much more in favor of abortion the earlier in pregnancy it is, but that's kind of the opposite of what's happening.
Absolutely. That is a loss for the anti-abortion movement. It is also a loss for healthcare because abortion is very safe no matter when you get it, but it is safer and easier the earlier you are in pregnancy. When you are in your first trimester, you have more options. You can do medication, you can do a procedure, but where we are is patients just don't have the ability to get from, South Texas to New Mexico or Arizona or Illinois within as quick a time as they would like to. They need to find the money, find the time off, find the appointment, figure out all those barriers we talked about, and then get to the next appointment available in clinics that have been overwhelmed. And that can take several weeks. And the thing about pregnancy is it just keeps going. And then before you know it, you are 15 weeks pregnant. And this is the abortion that you wanted when you were 6 weeks along, but you couldn't get it until this point. The other thing that does, of course, is it puts more strain on providers because medication abortions, which are very common and effective in the first trimester, are easy. You give someone some pills, you talk to them about the consequences, and you do follow up later, and they take the pills on their own. Now you have to do these procedures. If someone is later, that takes longer, takes more resources. It limits what capacity you have when you already are seeing a much higher demand.
This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Pet injuries and additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
So the way that this is sort of rippling out, you don't have to be pregnant and you don't have to be seeking birth control to have this affect you, right? It's affecting the actual supply of health professionals in some of these states.
It absolutely is. And I know you've done really great work on this. This was a really important part of the book, was what this means for the training of medical professionals moving forward. And if you go become a medical resident, the trainee after med school in a state with an abortion ban, there's a real problem, which is you can't learn how to provide abortions as an aspiring OB-GYN in a state that outlaws abortion. And this matters because of abortion care. It also matters for miscarriage care because those are the same. We treat abortions the same way we treat miscarriages, and people medically, yes, of course. And you don't see enough miscarriages as a resident often to become really proficient to provide excellent care. So abortions are really helpful in getting up to speed, being really excellent at doing this for patients. And I have spoken to so many doctors who are just deeply concerned about what is going to happen. Are we going to have like half of our medical system be full of doctors who just weren't able to become trained in providing this care because it wasn't legal for them, and the only option they had was to fly out of state once a month to get training and then come back to where they lived otherwise? It's pretty untenable, and there are other concerns about long-term deterring doctors from becoming OB-GYNs at all and choosing other specialties. And this is already a difficult field. It is one where we don't have enough providers, where there are, greater expenses, higher malpractice insurance, lower reimbursement rates. We, from a public health standpoint, do not want to be deterring doctors from going into OB-GYN care, but that is exactly what these laws could do.
And it's not just obstetrics and gynecology. We're seeing this sort of across the board, that graduating students don't want to go to states with abortion bans or restrictions, partly because of who they are, not necessarily because of what kind of doctor they want to be.
Exactly. The majority of healthcare workers are women. And when you think about the timing of medical school, very often by the time you are a resident, that might be when you're thinking about starting a family. And I have spoken to so many, future physicians who understand that if they live somewhere with an abortion ban, that could affect them professionally and it could affect them personally. And if they have a choice, they would much rather live somewhere where they know that if they become pregnant and something goes wrong, they will have access to the standard medical care and not have to worry about it being compromised by a state's laws.
I was surprised to see so many doctors in states where abortion is clearly legal who were concerned about providing abortions to people coming from states where it's illegal. Talk about that.
And some of that is starting to shift because we have these shield laws in place, but what those do is they protect physicians only when they are in the states where the laws exist. And I've spoken to doctors asking them, would you want to provide medication abortions to someone in Texas while you're in California? And they aren't sure because some of them are licensed in, a state like Kansas as well, and they don't want to jeopardize that license and not be able to provide care there. They also know that if they ever went to a state whose law they had broken, even when they weren't in it, you have a layover in Texas on your way somewhere else. Dallas-Fort Worth is a huge airport. Like, you could be in legal trouble. And that is a tremendous thing to ask of people who are doing this, yes, because they love it, but also because it's a career. It's how they support their lives and their families. And to something that we spoke to earlier about, there is just so much legal uncertainty right now that it's very difficult as a physician to know what you can be doing safely and what might, even if not now, someday put you in legal jeopardy.
And going forward, I mean, there are efforts to outlaw abortion nationwide, and there are ways to do it, right?
Exactly. There's the Comstock Act, which we have talked about a lot. It is this 19th century anti-immorality law. It was used to, ban Ulysses, ban Leaves of Grass, and it is also was used to restrict access to birth control and to abortion. And the birth control provisions have been repealed, but the anti-abortion provisions are still on the books, have never been repealed, have not been enforced because in part of Roe. But an anti-abortion presidential administration could use those levers to ban medication abortion nationwide or to ban abortion across the country. And that is something that the former President Trump has not weighed on explicitly, but many of his former advisors have, and they would love to do that if given the chance.
There's also cases in front of the Supreme Court. I mean, this is not, you're talking about how uncertain the law is. The law hasn't finished developing where it's going to go, has it?
Exactly. And I mean, there were doctors I spoke to in this book who were just sitting from their offices in New York, watching cases play out in Texas, play out in Idaho, wondering what is this going to mean for me and how I provide care in New York. The judges who are making these decisions, I did not vote for them. They are not accountable to me. And yet they could institute decisions that will make it very difficult for me to give my patients a standard of care. We've talked about the mifepristone case in front of the Supreme Court. That is a very obvious example. It speaks in large part to how concerned the anti-abortion movement is about medication abortion and their desire to restrict access to it because of its effectiveness in undercutting abortion bans. In that case, I mean, we'll see how the court rules, but it's really an opening salvo in a longer campaign to limit access to medication abortion and to ultimately lay the legal groundwork for a jurisprudence that would allow for national abortion bans.
And we should talk about personhood, which is also a goal for some people, which is the idea that as soon as an egg is fertilized, it becomes a person with full legal rights. That could have implications well beyond abortion.
Absolutely. We have already started to see that play out temporarily in Alabama, and that all happened after this went to print. So, I mean, it's not something that we talked about, but it is something that the ideas are very clear, which is if you believe that a fertilized egg, an embryo, is a person, you don't support IVF, you don't support some kinds of birth control because you see this egg in the sperm and you say, we have to protect that, even though like a lot of those would never actually become a fetus, let alone become a live being. But that is a very natural endpoint for a large sector of the anti-abortion movement. They are concerned about the politics right now and would like to do their best to wait until some of the anti-Dobbs backlash has abated. But it is absolutely something on their mind and something that we are going to start seeing play out in state courts across the country and eventually in state legislatures.
What could it mean beyond things like, making IVF illegal?
I mean, miscarriage could be illegal, and that is really striking because any one of us who becomes pregnant could miscarry, and that if you view the loss of a fertilized egg as murder, as manslaughter, what have you, then what does that mean for the person who was carrying that? Do you blame them legally? We already do have anti-miscarriage stigma that exists against a lot of people who lose their pregnancies. Like, we can't control that, and that makes pregnancy as a whole just so much more legally dangerous. really builds upon the idea that I heard over and over from patients and providers in this book, this notion that if you can become pregnant, you are a second-class citizen.
We've already seen in some states prosecutors going after, investigating pregnant women for things that they might do while they're pregnant, or if they miscarry in what are considered suspicious circumstances. I imagine that this is only going to sort of grow.
Yeah, and I mean, to your point, like, that's not new. We had that before the Dobbs decision as well. And what we do know about the prosecutorial, going after people who miscarry is it is usually going after women of color or low-income white people. Like, this is not something that happens equally. It is in many ways discriminatory. And there is a real concern that as the anti-abortion movement becomes more emboldened and as they find more laws that are passed or find old laws they can use, whether that is, something about chemical endangerment or, I don't know, some kind of like murder statute, people will start trying to use those as well to really pick and choose how they want to enforce anti-abortion, not just law, but ideology.
I was taken by how many women or patients, I should include Jasper, were so worried about what might happen to them, but also had so much difficulty finding information. I guess, having reported on this for so long, it seems that there's so much information that's out there. You just, go Google something and it all comes up. It doesn't all come up.
It really depends on who you are, where you live, and how your algorithm works. Like, I spent some time at an abortion clinic that was just getting started in Illinois, and they couldn't get listed on Google for a long time because they were so new. It is much easier now than it was a couple of years ago to find information about self-managing abortion, but you have to know what keywords to search, whether that's mifepristone or abortion pill or Plan C or aid access. And these are things that we know about because we write about these. These are things people who are online in the right internet spaces know about because it comes up in their community. But it's not as widespread as many of us would think. And the thing about any kind of healthcare is you don't think about it until you have to. Like, I don't wake up thinking, maybe in a few years I'll need a colonoscopy, because why would I? And by the same measure, people don't think about abortion, what the law is, how to find it, what it means to get an abortion, until they absolutely must.
So talk about abortion funds, which I think is something else that people that are out there that people don't know about.
It's so striking to me how important abortion funds are and how few people know about them. They are these small, nonprofit, often very, very low staff organizations. They take money in, they get it from donors, and they give it to people for abortions. Some of them focus on the cost of travel, some of them focus on the cost of the procedure, some of them partner with clinics. They basically help undercut this immense financial barrier that has always existed, but especially now for people seeking abortions. And they play a critical role. They are also really, really struggling at the moment because there's just so much more demand on them. Travel is expensive. It is becoming more expensive as people have further to go. And after Dobbs, we saw a really immense surge in donations to abortion clinics. A lot of people who were really angry gave all this money. It's what the clinic staff or the fund staffers call rage giving. And that's kind of ended. After the Florida ban took effect, for instance, they did not see a surge in donations in Florida abortion funds. And what that is going to show us is longer term, people continuing to have to travel further and further, more and more expensive distances, take on higher costs to get an abortion. Maybe you're going from Miami to Virginia, which is crazy. And the funds that are there to try and help you just do not have the resources anymore to support everyone in need. They have said that they do not think they'll be able to cover the costs of everyone who comes for them anymore.
I want to talk about sort of how we got here. We think obviously abortion has been a huge issue for the last couple of years. It's been a brewing issue for many years, but it goes back certainly longer than the history of the country, right?
Absolutely. I mean, abortion stigma is as old as America, and the right to an abortion is also as old as America. And we've seen, from the 1800s, efforts to stigmatize, to outlaw. We saw doctors opposing abortion because they hated the midwives who performed them, and it was part of a way to disempower women was to restrict abortion. But the anti-abortion movement as we know it didn't really come into full existence until the 20th century. And it didn't become as powerful as it is until like right after Roe, when they saw themselves lose and they said, we have to overturn this. They began immediately working to get abortion bans legal again. And they were very focused. They figured out how to work through legislatures, how to work through public opinion, how to work through the federal government, and they won.
There's also been this big flip-flop. When I first started covering abortion, first of all, it was not at all partisan. You had, sort of abortion rights Democrats and Republicans and anti-abortion Democrats and Republicans. But by and large, in the early years before Roe, Republicans were more in favor of abortion rights. Democrats were more against it. And yet that's turned around completely.
And I mean, that's part of a much broader history, right, of the whole realignment of political institutions. There's a million reasons for that. Civil rights. Think about, I just read a lot of Lyndon B. Johnson biographies. He played a role. But you're absolutely right that there were anti-abortion Democrats, and there are a couple of pro-abortion Republicans, but they are so rare now compared to what they used to be. It's really become just like, if you support abortion rights, the only party for you is Democrats. And if you oppose abortion rights, then you have to be in the Republican Party. And this is actually something that we are starting to see kind of unravel in elections, because we've seen so many elections that are abortion specific, whether your state constitution protects the right to an abortion. And a lot of Republicans are crossing over to vote for abortion rights when they have the chance to do so, even if they would probably vote for a Republican otherwise. And that is going to be something that I think is really interesting to consider longer term. Does this fuel any kind of realignment? Maybe it doesn't, but maybe it at the very least complicates how we think about how people vote and for whom and why.
And it's going to vary by state too, right? I mean, one you can look at some of these very conservative states that have voted for abortion rights ballot measures. I mean, things that no one expected, like Kansas, Kentucky, and yet in those states, there's still, it seems that the legislatures and the governors who are Republican are still pretty anti-abortion, even in the face of their voters, have obviously some of their Republican voters, because they're Republican states, having gone the other way.
Exactly, and it really speaks to these conflicting influences that they have to work with, right? Because they obviously care about their voters, but they also care about the very influential, very wealthy anti-abortion movement that has paid its dues, has worked to make sure that it is a key constituency that the Republican Party cannot ignore. This is the story of what we saw in Florida, because Florida initially had, they didn't pass abortion bans. It was a very pro-abortion state. And then in the lead up to Dobbs, they passed a 15-week ban. And the promise was, well, this is our compromise. This is our Florida deal. We are sticking to our middle of the road solution. That, of course, isn't what happened. Right after the decision, there was a campaign to pass a 6-week ban instead. It was endorsed heavily by the anti-abortion movement, local and national. National anti-abortion folks said Florida is our priority, and Florida passed a 6-week ban. And this really underscores, I think, that no matter where your voters are, and Florida voters strongly support abortion rights, if you look at any polling, that's a piece of the puzzle, but what matters perhaps more is who are the institutions and organizations that you have aligned yourself with and whose support you count on for political success.
So that leads me to organized medicine, which has a very, I will say, checkered history on this issue. Where has organized medicine been, and where is it now?
In both of our lifetimes, organized medicine has supported abortion restrictions. We were just talking yesterday about how they supported the partial birth abortion ban under George Bush. And what we have now is the American Medical Association has come out largely against abortion bans. They have come out quite strongly in the Idaho case, looking at whether emergency medical laws protect doctors' rights to provide abortions. And that switch I think, speaks to a lot of things. Part of it is that the medical establishment is younger now, is more diverse, has spent more time, becoming more aware of what this means. They're not trying to, kick women out of the profession. But it also speaks to the fact that doctors' autonomy is being really, really constrained and affected by these laws. They cannot provide care that they may not have considered as abortion. They thought it was just, protecting a pregnant person experiencing complications, and are now realizing that, wow, this is really, really important, and it could make it unsafe for me to practice the career I devoted myself to.
Doctors are really in a difficult position in a lot of states, because if they provide what's the standard of care, they could be prosecuted in some of these states, and if they don't, they could be sued for malpractice.
And that is a dynamic that has actually played out in Texas to an extent, not in terms of a lawsuit, but there is this case before the state Supreme Court. These all women who had pregnancy complications could not get an abortion. The case of Amanda Zarowski, who has become a spokesperson for President Biden, I mean, she had to wait until she was in sepsis before she could get an abortion. And the state has said, well, that's not the fault of our laws. You really should be suing your doctors, because they are the ones who did not understand how to read the laws. And the plaintiffs have argued, no, our doctors are doing the best they can, but there is so little clarity and so little daylight when we think about what this narrow, confusingly written exception actually covers, that they could not legally, in good faith, say that this abortion was covered and protected.
It's funny, exceptions to bans have been an issue as long as there have been bans. The Hyde Amendment, which prohibits federal abortion funding, has been changed numerous times. At one point, funding was only allowed to save the life of the woman. Then they had rape and incest, and they took it out. Then they put it back. What are we finding about these exceptions to bans now that obviously are pretty widely supported, and even many Republicans say they support?
Exceptions are very politically popular, and they largely don't work. There is a lot of data that shows that even when states have abortion bans with exceptions, like, no one's getting an abortion, which suggests that these are not working. And if we look at the text of what these exceptions stipulate, it is very, very, very onerous. You might need a police report or a restraining order or some other legal documentation if you're trying to get an abortion for a case of rape or incest. The vast majority of sexual assaults are never reported. That is just not a feasible thing to ask of someone, especially within a 6 or 15-week timeline. It makes this an exception on paper, but in practice, it is just not something that people can be or are using.
I know doctors have been asking for more clarity for some of these exceptions. Are they getting it anywhere?
They are doing their best, but the largest thing I hear still is confusion. There are occasional laws that are passed. I think Florida just put out some guidance saying that actually if someone experiences PPROM, preterm premature rupture of membrane, that is something that will be covered by the state's exceptions. And that's tremendous. Some states have gone back to try and add exceptions around ectopic pregnancy specifically, although others, like Texas, they add this exception, but they also say, well, you can have an affirmative defense, which means you provide the abortion, you could still be sued, but you can prove that you were doing it under the exception, and then you'll be okay, which really does not help a lot of physicians. But what doctors keep saying is these small things might help us with some patients here and there, but pregnancy is so complicated, it is just not feasible for us to create a laundry list of exceptions and say we have covered every possible situation that could come up. The only thing that they say really works is trusting them.
Yeah, and of course, we've seen with these exceptions. There was a case of a woman who was actively bleeding and was sent out to wait in her car in the parking lot until she was sick enough that the doctors could justify saying she was going to die if she didn't get the abortion.
And the thing about that is, even if you save the patient's life, when you almost die, there are long-term health consequences, and those may not be counted as a direct death caused, but a shortened lifespan or harder time being healthy while you are alive is still patient harm that we should be thinking about when we consider the impact these laws have had.
Where's the public on this? Obviously we see lots of polls going back and forth, but do you feel like this has come much more into the forefront of reporting and people talking about it? It's something that's been hidden. Is it bringing along the public, or is the public just dividing itself even more the way it was before?
It is interesting because Republicans largely follow the Republican Party line. They largely oppose abortion. But the majority of the public as a whole, including independents, do not approve of the state of how things are. They support the right to an abortion broadly. They generally believe that this should be a decision left up to a patient and a doctor. They do not support the idea of leaving it up to the states, as former President Trump has said he would do. They think there should be federal abortion protections. This is all in line with where public opinion was before. Most Americans supported Roe while it was law of the land. But what What has changed is that this is more of a priority for many voters. There are these maybe not single issue abortion voters, but top issue abortion voters. There are some who are much older and some who are much younger, perhaps, and we don't know why, but it is really striking that this could be a presidential election where abortion may not shape the election, but will be much more influential than it ever has been.
The U.S. is one of the few countries in the world that's actually moving towards more restrictions on abortion. The rest of the country, the rest of the world is going the other way. Do we have any feel why?
We have a very, very successful and influential anti-abortion movement with ties to a very powerful religious right. And that is largely what is at play here. And what I found to be so interesting while researching this book is the overturning of Roe has actually been cited by religious conservatives in other countries as a model. They are trying to take steps and strategies from what has been done here and replicate it in countries like Italy, where they, are a very religious country, but they're not doing it as well as we are. And so they want to see what they can learn from us. There are, these March for Lives that are emulating the ones that we have here. They have these 30 Days for Life movements that are tied to Texas-based organizations. And so we have this very effective movement that isn't as prevalent in other parts of the world, but it could be.
One of the things we didn't talk about is some of these sort of more imaginative ways the anti-abortion movement has gone about trying to accomplish its goal, and that was sort of the Texas bounty law, if you will. I mean, talk about Texas before Roe was overturned.
I will never forget where I was when we found out that the Texas 6-week ban was going into effect. We got that decision very late at night. We had been waiting for it. The law was already in effect, but they were hoping that the Supreme Court would block it. And I woke up and looked at my phone and I was like, well, they didn't block it. It's taking effect. And the moment that happened, I thought it was very clear. My editor thought it was very clear. And every doctor I've spoken to since agreed that Roe was going to be overturned, because whether or not it would be with the Dobbs case, there had been a clear sign from the Supreme Court that you can circumvent this protection. Here is a clear strategy to do it. If you would like to do the same, have at it.
Explain how they did that, though.
It's quite ingenious, and famously was described as crafted by some geniuses, by Supreme Court Justice Kagan. If you got an abortion, you were not targeted by the law, but anyone who aided or abetted the provision of the abortion, that could be your doctor, it could be your Uber driver, it could be someone who gave you money, someone who, bought you lunch afterward, could be sued by, and I think it was $100,000. It's been a while, so I think that was the number.
I think it's
10,000. 10,000, excuse me, yes, it was $10,000.
Minimum of $10,000.
Minimum of $10,000, you could be sued by any private actor. It was not a state law, it was a civil suit law. And this did not criminalize abortion explicitly, but it made it functionally impossible to provide, because if you provide it, you risk this suit that would be untenable to actually go through with. You would have to defend yourself in court, and you probably would lose at least $10,000. And this was so smart, because it wasn't a ban on abortion, but practically it was. Like, if you could argue, listen, doctors can go out there and provide abortions as long as they're willing to pay $10,000 every time, but it means that you could be sued out of existence. And after that ban took effect, what we did see was, even while states were preparing for the Dobbs decision, figuring out what kind of bans they would want, there were a couple, Idaho and Oklahoma, who also passed copycats of this Texas law, just in case, so that no matter what, they would be able to ban abortion when the time came.
And of course it couldn't, at that point, the Supreme Court didn't need to overrule it, because it technically circumvented the way Roe worked, because it didn't implicate any of the state officials.
Mm-hmm. And they said that this is a really interesting, novel legal question. Wow, we should think about this. So smart. What a great scholarly thing for us to consider. But that was ultimately what they found, was that this didn't break Roe because it didn't ban abortion, and they didn't have to weigh in on that question. And I actually remember listening to, as the case later progressed, an appeals judge in New Orleans in the Fifth Circuit saying, well, we don't need to weigh on this too much, because who knows? The laws on abortion could change soon enough. We're all waiting on that Dobbs decision. And she was right.
So how much has this new sort of creative way to try to restrict abortion impacted the abortion rights forces?
I think they are trying their best to figure out ways to overcome these bans. And something that we talked about, right, is the shield law provision. It's very clever. It is, you pass laws that protect doctors in your state, you rely on medication abortion and something that can be mailed, can be very safely, effectively taken at home. You find other ways to help people get around these very, very punitive laws. But what I think we will see over time is maybe not a cold war, maybe a hot war, honestly, but different, trying to outsmart each other, figuring out what are the creative ways I can do no matter what side I'm on to, even without explicitly banning what you are doing, to find a way around it. And I think it's an open question where that takes us.
And now we're talking about travel bans.
Mm-hmm. And the Supreme Court has been pretty clear that you can't ban travel, at least for now. But we absolutely are seeing efforts to try and, at the very least, deter people from traveling bans. And that actually will be another test of shield laws, because the care in that case in Colorado was provided in Colorado is protected under a shield law. The state is not going to comply with any Texas-based subpoenas. So we'll see how that goes and where that takes us.
But in Texas, we're seeing these local travel. How are those supposed to work?
Those are they rely again on this this civil litigation structure. They again do not target the pregnant person, but they say if you drive through my town and are carrying a pregnant person to get an abortion out of state, then anyone could sue you, the driver who's driving this other person. They've been passed in like a few parts of Texas. They haven't had much of an effect yet, only because how do you enforce that? How do you know why someone is driving, where they are going, whether they went through your town? I can imagine we could someday see a case come out through that, but it does seem much more difficult to pull off than something like SB 8, the 6-week abortion ban was.
And yet, we haven't talked about it explicitly, but there is the chilling effect. We did see in Texas after the 6-week civil ban went into effect that abortion providers stopped providing abortions.
Yes.
Even though they didn't technically have to stop providing them, certainly not before 6 weeks. A lot of them did because they just didn't want to take the legal risks.
And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, right? People don't know what their rights are. They are confused. They are afraid. I have spoken to people who don't know if they are legally allowed to leave their state for travel, who don't know if they are allowed to take the second medication of their abortion at home. And again, they should be able to because the laws don't target them. But there is a real culture of confusion and a real culture of fear that is amplified by all of these different laws and bans and municipal codes being passed that may or may not have a concrete effect, but that certainly add to the confusion that exists.
We've talked a little bit about the abortion pill. I guess 63% of abortions are now done using medication rather than a procedure. But the future of the abortion pill is not assured either, is it?
It is absolutely not. The Supreme Court is hearing a case, and the case was filed in Texas. It originally, the anti-abortion plaintiffs were trying to get mifepristone, one of the 2 medication abortion pills, taken off the market completely. They wanted the court to say the FDA made a mistake, more than 20 years ago when they approved this pill, and they didn't consider it carefully enough. It should be taken off the market. They rushed. The facts show they did not rush. They spent a lot of time looking at a lot of data at the pill that is very safe and very effective. The Supreme Court is not weighing in specifically on whether to take the pill off the market, but they are considering more recent efforts to expand access, including the ability to provide it through telemedicine, and including which doctors are allowed to provide it, which healthcare professionals, and at what point in pregnancy it can be used, because it is safe. It is approved up through 10 weeks. I've spoken to doctors who would do it through 12 because the evidence is so strong, but the court, if they found in favor of the anti-abortion plaintiffs, would take that back to 7 weeks, which is just so early that it would not be usable for a lot of people. And we'll see how the court rules. There are a lot of questions about whether the plaintiffs have standing, whether they have proven that they have experienced actual harm from this pill being available as is and have the right to challenge it. But if they did succeed, it would have really significant implications for all of the people who use medication abortion, whether that is through the mail or just simply at home, because it is what they prefer. And I've spoken to doctors who, some of them would switch to a different, less effective, more painful, still effective, still safe mechanism where you use more of this other drug, misoprostol, the second medication used. But I have spoken to some doctors who don't know what they would do. They do worry that the misoprostol-only regimen is not as good, is not the appropriate care they should be given. They don't know if they should drop telemedicine in that situation, if they should just keep doing mifepristone by mail as long as they can. And what it really underscores is just how, even though it feels like it has been a lifetime of 2 years, we are in the early days of figuring out what all of this is going to look like and what it will mean.
I mean, a Trump administration could just appoint a head of the Food and Drug Administration who could just cancel the approval, right?
They absolutely could. And I mean, historically, right, there hasn't been, there's always tried to be some level of independence of the FDA specifically from the politics of the president, but all things are off when you have someone who has often talked about using different levers of the administration to specifically further political aims. And if, depending on the priorities of the people in a Trump administration, how they want to go on abortion, and a lot of them do oppose abortion quite strongly, his advisors, it's not at all out of the question that that's something that a Trump FDA could do.
So what are you looking at going forward? Obviously, as you say, we're in early days of this. There's an awful lot of things that have yet to sort of play out.
I am waiting to see what happens with telemedicine, whether it becomes even more expansive. I am also really curious, especially now, about what it means to live in the South, because for a lot of our post-Roe history, Florida still allowed abortion through 15 weeks. Florida no longer does, and what that means is, if you look at a map of the United States, half of it doesn't allow abortion, and most of that is in the South. And losing this state in particular, Florida, the third biggest state in the country, in addition to Texas, the second biggest, losing that many abortion clinics, that many providers, displacing that many patients, I think will have really significant implications. And I want to keep seeing what happens to the people who need care.
And write another book?
We'll see.
Shefali Luthra, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you are interested in podcasts about nonfiction books, listen to C-SPAN's Book Notes Plus podcast for interviews with authors and historians hosted by Brian Lamb.